recently, for modernism, we've been thinking a bit about the post-war period, which was unique in a number of things, in that modern architecture then began to deal with things at varying scales. And you found that there were planners as well as architects. And sometimes they were the same thing, and sometimes they crossed over. And that meant that the scale of work got quite large. And in that context, in this country, the repairs after the war became a big task that involved those people. I went into more general, but Jeremy, as emeritus professor from Plymouth and the Historic England, he wrote the basic book on Coventry, which I would recommend to everybody. And I think I'll let you go on from there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? Good, excellent, excellent. I'm going to restrict my talk this evening to the centre of Coventry only. And the reason for that is because it's such a complicated subject, but you must remember that the same group of architects and planners were also redeveloping the suburbs and the outer edges of Coventry at exactly the same time, a mammoth task. And I mean, I have a separate lecture about the suburbs, which I can bore you with perhaps one day. But this is going to be about the city centre, and I'm not going to talk very much about the cathedral. First of all, because I'm not an expert on the cathedral, you need to ask Louise Campbell, who most certainly is. And also, it would require another lecture. So I'm going to slightly skirt around the edges of the cathedral. But obviously the cathedral is one of the most important and best preserved modern buildings in the city. This is an aerial view of Coventry in the late 1930s, about 1937. And what you're looking at is a medieval plan. A medieval city which hadn't changed its plan since it started to expand in the 19th century. Coventry was expanding at a far greater rate than any other city in Britain. The population in the late 19th century was around 70,000. By the First World War, it had grown to 170,000. And by the 1930s here, it was the centre of a conurbation of about 230,000. And in the late 1930s, it grew by a further 30,000 because it was making munitions for the war effort. So this enormous expansion had happened, but none of it had really altered the plan of the city. It didn't have the sort of major city fathers that a Birmingham or the northern towns had. So there was no great civic statement, no great roads, no great planning of the 19th century. So what we're looking at here is Broadgate, that's that square in the middle, which is the centre of the medieval plan. There's the cathedral, with All Souls Church next to it, the two spires together. And over here, you can just pick up the spire of Greyfriars. So the three spires dominated what is otherwise a low-rise city. A lot of those buildings being half-timbered, left over from the Middle Ages. J.B. Priestley famously said in his English Journey in 1933 that you could film the Meistersinger in Coventry. You know, that it was a sort of set for something rather ancient and venerable. The only improvements, in inverted commas, you see here are that street there, Corporation Street, which was designed by the city engineer Ernest Ford in the 30s. And you can see here that Trinity Street, coming out of Broadgate, is being formed. And that rather ugly new block is Owen Owen's department store, new in 1937. And the Co-op here, and the site for the new Hippodrome Theatre at the end of those building works. And here's Coventry, taken by the English Heritage Tiger Moth in about 2012, the same view. So you can see the cathedral, got a oblique angle here, the cathedral here, and then this great axis going down through the middle of what became the shopping precinct, the cross street of Market Street with Hillman House, flats here, Coventry Point here, Mercia House, more flats on the end here. Here's Corporation Street going round, and way beyond out here, you can see part of the Ring Road, built in the 1960s. And then what's become Coventry University and the cathedral is all this part here. And what I'm really talking about is why and how that happened. The architecture of the 1930s in Coventry is a mixed bunch. For a city which was concerned with technology, it made motor cars, aeroplanes, bombs, bicycles, batteries, tyres, weaving, Courtaulds, Jaguar cars, Hillman, all those names come from Coventry. There's an amazing statistic which says in the 50s that 30% of the world's motor cars were made in Coventry. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not, but it sounds good. And it might be true, it just might be true. But the architecture they were putting up in the 30s was this, a steel frame building with cladding, and we're used to those, our new banks, because there was money in Coventry. On the left is Lloyd's Bank by Buckland and Hayward of Birmingham in a rather pompous neo-Roman, I suppose. And on the right, rather better, Palmer and Holden's National Provincial Bank of the early 30s, looking out into a widened high street, the street that goes here in front of them. So there was new building, but in a slightly different range of styles. And there's the Hippodrome, the only theatre in town, again of the mid-30s, by Stanley Hattrell and Partners, local architects. Uncomfortable, I think, in its sort of Art Deco grandness, not knowing quite which direction it's facing, and certainly a very odd neighbour to these little old buildings left over at the side of it. Became later the venue where the Beatles performed in Coventry, I'm glad to say. And this rather bad drawing is showing the motor industry headquarters, or factories, I should say, in the 1930s. And there's the cathedral in the centre there, look, and Broadgate, and Corporation Street is just winding round there. And there, all around it, are these factories. I don't know whether you can read that list, but they're all the names you know and love, of the manufacturers, mostly of motor cars. So the factories were crammed into the old town, no room to expand, extremely bad communications. And the houses that were in amongst them were really slums. They were in a very, very bad condition. Nothing much had happened to them for years and years. And then, of course, came the Blitz. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but the Blitz started in early 1940 and continued through to 1942. The night of the 14th of November 1940 was the major bombing of Coventry. This is John Piper's drawing of the cathedral the next morning. The cathedral was the only British cathedral to be bombed during the Second World War, and it more or less wiped out the whole area around the cathedral. So that overnight, as it were, the site had been cleared for the various plans by the various architects and planners who were hovering, literally hovering, waiting to get their hands on this city. A great opportunity had arisen, it was said. Great opportunities require leaders, and this is the leader of Coventry, George Hodgkinson, as mayor here in 1944. He's a very, very interesting character. He's a trades unionist, comes up through the old Independent Labour Party, becomes secretary of the Coventry Labour Party, and works as an engineer for Daimler in Coventry. He was a communist, and he won the election in 1937, the first time that Labour got a majority in the city, wiping out the inadequate, I will say, going carefully, amalgam of Conservatives and Liberals that had run it before. So at last it gave him control of the city for the next 30 years. The next election he lost was 1967, Harold Wilson's election, where Harold had made a few mistakes and people punished him for it. So for 30 years, George Hodgkinson was in charge of the city, and his intention was to build a socialist city. As a sort of rebuff to Ramsay MacDonald's hopeless 1931 Labour government, which failed to bring in the reforms that people like Hodgkinson thought they should. He was a great communicator, and here he is, I love it, looking the other way, while the King and Queen, with Donald Gibson, the city architect, inspect the bomb model of the city. The first thing that George Hodgkinson did was to appoint a city architect, which is a post that had never existed before. So that on the 1st of January 1938, Donald Gibson was recruited to be city architect. More in a second. The second city architect I'm talking about is Arthur Ling from 1955, seen here with the model of Basil Spencer's Cathedral and Lanchester College Hall of Residence next to it, bang, next to it, as a sort of pipe dream. He's looking rather serious about that. And then, after him came Terence Gregory in 1973, in his office, with that tower in behind him, the completed cathedral here, latched onto the ruins of the old one, the Herbert Art Gallery and the City Library behind him. And he lasted through till 1974, when local government was reorganised, and he became actually the chief executive of the city. Donald Gibson, a graduate of Manchester University School of Architecture, and had never really worked as an architect. He worked for a year in the Isle of Ely as a deputy architect. He did lecturing at Liverpool University, building construction, interestingly, and became enthralled by Patrick Abercrombie, the professor of town planning at Liverpool, the most important British town planner of the period, and studied town planning under him, and was also influenced by Walter Gropius, who came to Liverpool to lecture in the later 1930s. The first thing that Gibson did when he arrived, 1939, was to convince Hodgkinson that he needed a new city plan. So this is before the bombing. And the area he chose was east of the cathedral. So here's the cathedral, and Holy Trinity next to it. Broadgate is here. There's Owen Owen's department store, new. And there's the new road going out. And he swept away all the buildings in this area except for the council house here, which was 1920s Tudor. And this rather important little thing, which is the Herbert Art Gallery. Herbert was a local industrialist and had given money for an art gallery in the neoclassical style. So that got left on the site that was originally planned for it. But as you see, the rest of everything was swept away to form a new civic centre. And what's interesting about it is that it rejects the sort of continental Le Corbusian plan of towers, but it keeps the idea of the Jardin Anglais, a sort of nebulous landscape through which people can roam, write poetry, sit on the grass, all the things that proper people do in cities. And they can go and swim in the open air down at Poole Meadow here, having arrived by bus at the bus station, or they can go to the theatre here. That wedge shape is a sort of shorthand in the 1940s and 50s for theatre, based on Marcel Breuer's scheme at Cowcross. If you know that competition design, that comes out time and time again as the shape of a theatre through the 1930s and 40s. But these narrow blocks, I think, are more Gropius-like. They're the Zielenbau of Gropius's Siemensstadt in Berlin and those sorts of things. Narrow buildings, cross-ventilating, with lots of different entrances all the way through them. But it's a sort of interesting low-density plan, still keeping the spires as an important sort of marker in the city. To digress just a fraction about Abercrombie. Abercrombie was a huge influence. And this is his plan for Plymouth of 1943, which swept away the whole of the middle of Plymouth. The black dots here are the only old buildings remaining. And he drew, as you well know, this great axis from the railway station all the way through to the Hoe, and around it he set this almost symmetrical city, designed in a grand Beaux-Arts manner. And he talks about sort of architectural consistency akin to Georgian London or to Georgian Bath. Georgian architecture is often a reference point for this sort of architecture. But the grand axes of Haussmann's Paris are sort of brought to a slightly different scale. And of course, the city is divided up into functional zones. So that sorts out the awful problem of the 19th century muddled city, just like Coventry. You know, all this higgledy-piggledy stuff needed to be sorted out. So there's an industrial area, there's an arts centre, there's a civic area, and so on and so on. And then the housing is spread around the outside of it, as in that diagram, which is precisely what Abercrombie did at Plymouth and precisely what he was preaching at Liverpool and at London University afterwards. And the other important influence of this time is Lewis Mumford. I bet you that almost no one in this room has read Lewis Mumford. But Gibson gave this book to every councillor in Coventry when he arrived for them to read so they would know about modern planning. And I may say I have read it, and it's an incredibly difficult read. It's very, very, very difficult to work out what Mumford's trying to say. But do have a go. It's illustrated with terrible black and white fuzzy photographs. It doesn't describe any of the places that he's talking about in any detail whatsoever, but identifies the ills of the old city, meaning the 19th century city, and the glorious future that can be produced by sorting out problems of transport, particularly, problems of culture and belonging and community. He talks about the insensate industrial town. And that can be put right by bringing in culture and theatres and more poetry and more walking in gardens. And it's a great big thick book, and it is sort of fascinating to try and puzzle out what he's on about. And I have no idea what Coventry councillors actually made of it. However, they were convinced by Gibson's ideas for the city, and he was commissioned to go on and produce a plan as a rival to Ernest Ford's, the engineer's plan. And this is the first real plan for Coventry in 1941, which begins to set the scene for what was to follow. The cathedral is in the middle, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, using the old spire and then sort of latching onto it through a sort of crazy cloister, a new building, in the Gothic, of course. Here's Broadgate. But the first great innovation is to put all the shopping in one place, the shopping precinct. And that precinct is in 2 squares, and those 2 squares are totally pedestrianised. So a great, great invention, I think the first time it was ever thought about, that shopping should be separate from cars, the danger of the car is removed, and shopping becomes a sort of pleasure in amongst green lawns and so on, in the middle of its own precinct. And that idea, of course, goes right the way through all the plans for Coventry until it got built in the mid-50s. The other thing to look out for is the ring road. Here is a ring road at grade, but with various roundabouts around the edge, collecting the existing roads which spread out through Coventry. And within it is the beginnings of a grid plan. The new little Park Street, for example, here, which is the civic precinct, law courts, police station, magistrates' court, and so on, in here. A civic precinct up here, and then housing and so on, rather loosely drawn, it seems to me, in this bit left over here. And then a notion that the existing housing, all the way around the outside, stays in place. And what did it look like? Well, there were sketches which accompanied this, and it looked like all sorts of things. It looked like this, which is the Civic Centre and the museum next to it. I forget which is which, but you go through a great big colonnade, presumably, to get to them. Or, and more interesting in a way, here's Broadgate. In the middle is Lady Godiva. Very important to Coventry, Lady Godiva. Just as Francis Drake is important to Plymouth, she pops up everywhere. This is William Reed Dick's sculpture of Lady Godiva, given to the city by a local industrialist in the 1930s, and not erected actually until the 1950s, or 1949 maybe. Anyway, she's in the middle, and then there's this great archway, look. leading down to Hertford Street, and then that gap leads down the axis of the cathedral, which leads down through the city to the shopping precinct. So it's an axial plan based on Abercrombie. Well, that was extremely popular too, so Lord Iliff, local newspaper magnate, gave them lots of money and said, build me a model. And madness seems to have taken control after that. This is during the war, so maybe it's an act of propaganda. So here's Broadgate, up here, look. There's the archway coming through to Hertford Street, down here. Here's the precinct, now into three areas with the co-op, very important in Coventry, at the end here. And then the entertainments precinct here, theatres and cinemas with their parking. The market hall surrounded by offices. And then over here, the banks along High Street are all swept away, and the great big civic precinct arrives here with a sort of axis heading for the old council offices which are in here. Major thing. Worked on by Percy Johnson Marshall, whom again I hope we'll meet up with later on, who was Gibson's assistant. There's the axis looking down Little Park Street at the Tudor council offices, with this great sort of alleyway produced with these civic buildings placed around it. Well, everyone thought that was just terrible. Everyone complained. The new Ministry of Town and Country Planning under Lewis Silkin thought it was a terrible idea, because obviously they realised it was going to cost a shed load of money, and they didn't have any. So that was one reason to object to it. It was about 9 times the area of the actual area which had been blitzed in the war, whereas cities were only supposed to be redeveloping on the blitzed areas. The traders thought it was an absolutely appalling idea, and all revolted because, you know, no one will come to shops if it's pedestrianised, obviously, and the idea that these streets should be arcaded is another no-no, because you won't be able to see the shop fronts properly, and so on and so on and so on. So this scheme caused an amazing outrage. But what happened was that, you see what's happening here. Here's the axis going through to the Gilbert Scott Cathedral. There it is there in red. Here's the old centre of the city. Corporation Street, look, is that one, with the entertainments district still around the outside of it. But a new ring road at grade has arrived way beyond it. So it's the same plan, but bigger. And that's a grass boulevard going right the way around with cycle lanes and all sorts of things he talks about here in 1946, which, you know, no other city was really talking about. And all this was going to solve the problem of what to do in the centre. And the booklet, I've got it here actually, the booklet is The Future of Coventry, which was handed, they printed about 50,000 copies of this, which was handed out to everybody. And it is an amazing document, very seductive. There are other diagrams in it, rather vague diagrams. Here's the shopping precinct coming down from Broadgate. You can just pick up the arch to Hertford Street. And here's the 2 shopping precincts. But the traders were saying, no, you can't do that. We must have traffic coming through. So the cross street here, Market Street, Smithford Street, is still coming through with cars on it. There's Gibson's own sketch, not, I think, the world's greatest architectural draftsman. And there's his office's translation of it. And you dip down under a bridge to get you from the top precinct to the lower precinct. If you could just pick that up on there. But the composition, the idea of having blocks on corners and linked blocks between, carries on right the way through all of these schemes. It's a very Gibson idea. And here, right the way through into 1951 plan, another poor drawing, but there it is. You can just pick up Spencer's Cathedral drawn in there. And there are the 2 precincts, the shopping precincts, with their trafficked cross street going round. And the ring road is way out, look, all the way around out there, going all the way around. And this area here is labelled clubs. Clubbing clearly is an important part of Coventry life. This vast area is labelled as clubs in 1951, which is an interesting notion. What did that look like? Well, it looked like this. Whoa, Cyril Ferry's lovely perspective, which is a fold-out in this brochure, of Broadgate. So here's Lady Godiva, and there's the axis down to the shopping centre, with two great steel or aluminium poles with elephants on top. The elephant is the Coventry City crest. And there they are, two elephants. The archway through to Hertford Street. And then these quite interesting, modern-looking buildings surrounding them. And where does that architecture come from? Well, again, we play a game, don't we, with references and all the rest of it. I'll play my game, you can play yours. This is Walter Gropius. 1929 block of flats in Berlin. And this one, very influential, I think, the scheme at Windsor for Jack Pritchard, the one that came after the Law Road flats, which never happened, of course. But this fabulous scheme that Jack Pritchard devised is, I think remarkably similar, if I can just go back to that sort of architecture. So they were looking backwards and looking, I think, very interestingly to Gropius in terms of making it modular, gridded, repeating, perhaps prefabricated, all that Gropius was preaching in the late 1930s. And there's this lovely drawing produced sometime in the late 40s by Gibson's office of Broadgate House, as it became. They could find no developer to take this on, so they did it themselves. So here is the archway through to Hertford Street, the staircase and entrance to a restaurant, which is hung underneath here. A block, a block, a block, and then the link block in between. Shops under arcades underneath. And with that, there was a sort of and one aluminium pole with one elephant on top. What a lovely drawing that is. I just think it's just a terrific piece of graphics. What we're looking at, well, what young architecture students of that period were doing, they weren't going to France, which was dirty and the water was dangerous and all that. They were going to Scandinavia because it was easier. And on the left, I've shown Ragnar Ersberg's patent office in Stockholm, and then the Royal Institute of Technology at KTH by Niels Arbron on the right. The one on the left, 1911 to 1921, and the other one, 1939. So, there's this ordinary brick architecture of Sweden, the architecture of the Swedish welfare state, which had started in the earlier 1930s and was a model politically for the British version, and I think architecturally a model for the British version. And this is the sort of architecture that I think they were looking at. And there's a grander view of Broadgate, the landscape in the centre here by William Shiren, the landscape architect in Gibson's department, bulbs donated by the Dutch government because Coventry looked after a lot of refugees during the Second World War. And here's the bridge with the restaurant hanging underneath and the entranceway down into the precinct. An architecture of brick, Brockley City mixture, was the standard brick used for the whole of Gibson's city. And the language that he was using was defined. So the columns here are in Hornton stone. The main facades of the ordinary bits, the corners of the building, are in brick. And then the link blocks are edged in Westmoreland slate, green Westmoreland slate, so it expresses the structure, and infilled with travertine marble. So this thing here is a Verandil truss, clad in travertine marble, and the holes are the gaps of the Verandil truss, spanning from there to there. And there's just a little note of whimsy, just a little thing to be popular. Here is Lady Godiva, who pops out that window, and then peeping Tom up above glimpses her as she goes by on her horse. And you can, every hour on the hour, you can witness him still doing it. Designed by Trevor Tennant, quite an interesting sculptor of the 1940s and 50s. And there's coming down into the upper precinct. So you come through the gap between Broadgate House, this one, and the Leofric Hotel, that one there, into this precinct, which you can see is for lingering in. It's for sitting in, it's for enjoying the lights and the trees and the gardens and the fountains, great big fountain through there. It rather quickly, I'm afraid, became that. Surrounded on each side by offices designed by W.S. Hatchell and Partners, local architects, but I think Gibson's office told them what to do, told them what materials to use and all the rest of it. And there is the precinct, photograph taken in the 60s, full of people. It was a place for political rallies, for meeting, for music. All sorts of other activities happened in the precinct, very much the centre of the new Coventry. And there's one of the columns of Broadgate House, Hornton Stone, with Donald Gibson's name there. This is Fred Pooley, who became Buckinghamshire County Architect and President of the RIBA, who was one of the assistants. And I've not done all of them, but all around here are their initials cut into the stone, signing the building, which is a nice touch. I may say I'm using as a shorthand Gibson, Ling, etc. The job architects for all of these buildings were named when it was published. And there's a great long string of them. I might come to some of them at the end. But they were named in the publications. So they were very anxious to give their young architects the sort of billing that they deserved. Here's the Leofric on the other side, a luxury hotel in the 1950s, with next to it the Owen Owens store, the replacement for that brick one, by Rolf Hellberg, very good architect, local architect, wrote a book on shops and was placed in the Coventry Cathedral competition. Very, very good architect. This is his work here. I'll come to it in a second. But you can see the Leofric is not quite a mirror image, but the same sort of composition each side of the axis. Here's the inside of the Leofric, grand luxury in the mid-1950s. Very rare to get colour photos of these interiors, I may say. But terrifically rich interiors, and I think the idea is that the outside is ordinary, plain, straightforward, repetitive, and then the insides are the bit that we really care about, and it's colourful, and all the light fittings and the furniture and all the other lovely things are put in it to make it sing. And there's the reglazed Owen Owen department store facing onto Broadgate. I think a terrific thing. I think it's almost the only building in the city which achieves the right city scale. And I love the idea that through this curtain wall, originally of clear glass, you could see the mushroom columns structure going right the way out through this building, and you could see all the floor plates in behind. When you go around the corner, it looks like that, which is 955. I mean, really, really interesting. And I'm sure that Hellberg was sort of glancing over his shoulder at Eric Mendelssohn. That scale was very much what the perhaps more minor buildings of Mendelssohn were doing in the 1930s, or I should say late 1920s. This is the stair tower, and round the back it turns into yellow brick with little tiny porthole windows, which are the stores for each floor. Very, very good building. Then down to the precinct, the usual group of Marks and Spencer here by Norman Jones, Son and Rigby, British Home Stores by George Coles, and Woolworths by Harold Winborne, the Woolworths architect, are all again really designed by Gibson's department. So the four corners that make the crossing to Market Way are all the same composition, and these are ordinary buildings. And you have to get in tune with this, These are not screaming buildings, they are ordinary, in the nicest possible way. We've got used to architecture which yells at us, and this is a slow burn. This is, it's a simple bay of 20 feet or so, making up a shopfront. So this is 3 bays, one bay, total 5 bays. Then each 3 bay is here divided into 3 by Westman slate and travertine marble. Same trick on British Home Stores opposite. 1 bay here, 1 bay there, 3 bays in the middle, this time divided up in a different way. And then Woolworths, I'm looking at this facade here. Same thing, a bay each side of brick, and then 3 bays in the middle, slightly different from Marks and Spencer. So these things are sort of quite subtle in their way, and it's all about proportion and composition, which is what schools of architecture taught in those days. You did classes in composition, which I'm afraid to say no school of architecture now is remotely interested in. And there's the interiors of Dulcis shoe shop. Hooray for Dulcis. Isn't that wonderful? 1955, not Rolf Hellberg. I'll get her in the end. Ellis Samaki, who was the chief architect of Dulcis Shoes. He wrote the book with Rolf Hellberg, Ellis Samaki, with wonderful bolted glass assemblies, open tread staircase, fantastic light fittings, and then exotic marble at the back. It was a great time for very, very plush interiors. A lot of imported Italian marble was happening in the 1950s, and hardwoods from the colonies and so on. There are no colour photographs of these, I'm afraid to say, which is a real shame, and they disappeared in the 1960s. So we have no idea what they actually look like. And even the Co-op, as I said, an important building in Coventry, produced this very grand building with 9 bay of window here, and a rather similar composition with lovely lettering on the top and Hornton stone columns with sculpture by someone called Roger Skilton, who was another one of those rather good sculptors working in the city at the time. And the inside, the Co-op in black and white, I'm afraid, the supermarket part at the bottom, great revolution in the mid-1950s, and yes, the crockery department up above. And even the Coventry Evening Telegraph, Lord Iliffe's newspaper, swung in behind the idea, producing these arcades, this is in Corporation Street, clad in Westman slate with the same travertine marble infill, and a very lovely interior, which has now been converted into a hotel, and they've kept quite a lot of the good bits of the interior. And there's another sort of architecture going on in Gibson's department at the same time, which is the beginnings of the civic precinct. This is the police station in Little Park Street, with very simple little copper pitch roofs, Hornton stone, and mosaic panels, the white here. And I think what they're doing is looking at this sort of architecture. Danish architecture, C.F. Møller's Aarhus University on the left top, Gentofte Old People's Home here, and K. Fisker's Natural History Museum in Aarhus, this one. If you look back in the publications at the time, there wasn't a lot of good British building to publish. So the AR and AD and so on were looking elsewhere, and this is the sort of architecture that they were publishing. And I think that's exactly what Gibson and co. were looking at. And here's the beginning of the main civic building, where eventually the architecture department would have its office, in a rather similar style of brick and copper roofing. Gentle, pleasant architecture surrounded by gardens and so on. Gibson left in 1955 under a cloud. He just, I think, probably couldn't stand it anymore. I think there were just too many arguments, and it's not recorded which particular argument made him leave. But in return, they got Arthur Ling. Arthur Ling was an academic. He taught at University College and was a planning officer for the LCC. He worked for Maxwell Fry and Abercrombie on the County of London plan. There's that famous drawing by Ling in the County of London plan of the neighbourhood districts. So that was what Ling was all about. But more importantly, Ling was a communist. And that really mattered because the councillors thought this was great. A very proper communist architect. He was an expert on Soviet architecture, had visited Moscow lots of times. In his will, he left all his money to Anglo-Soviet relations. And there is no evidence that I've seen that he was a spy, but I think he might well have been. And it is sort of fascinating that this guy, he did well. He got, from London to Coventry and then on to Nottingham University and various other things thereafter. This is a 1961 plan, a rather bad drawing, but showing what Ling was doing. He was taking the shopping centre, Gibson's shopping centre, and making sure that Market Street and Smithford Way here could not be used for cars. They were going to become hell or high water, used for pedestrians only. So he builds a block of flats up above there, he builds a block of flats there, and he tries to build a hotel or maybe an office block there to make absolutely sure that traffic could not go through. He redesigns the market as a circular building, latched onto old buildings along here, and eventually the shopping centre breaks through onto Warwick Road here. He begins to think about the civic precinct. There's the police station, there's the beginnings of the civic offices. Here's Spencer's Cathedral, and he starts to work out this piece of planning east of the cathedral. Meanwhile, the ring road, look, is just starting to be built. There's the first bit at grade, according to Gibson's plan, and that very threatening dotted line is going all the way around the outside of the city. There's a slightly more sophisticated drawing done for architectural design in 1958. I don't know if you can make that out, but here's the cathedral, look. And what was once this area for clubs has become a whole load of buildings, because fortunately Lanchester College required new buildings. The old art school plus the technical college were uniting and making this new institution in the centre of the city, and they required land for new buildings. And this was the ideal place for it. So that's what's happening there. And look at the ring road. It's got bigger and bigger, and look at these great intersections. So almost all of this becomes road at grade here, dipping down here, but then starts to become a raised motorway, Britain's first urban motorway, advised by Colin Buchanan, who was yet to publish Traffic in Towns, 1963, the seminal work, and horrific, I think, to us now, if you, again, do get a copy and look at it, because it is the most horrendous document. But it was believed in, and the statistics that were used to produce it were done on an IBM computer, and that made it better. It made it believable, because this new technology was being used. And there's Ling, just a few weeks before his appointment at Coventry. Here he is here, in the Line Barn in Rotterdam, inspecting how other people did pedestrian streets. And there's my slides of the Line Barn, taken a few years ago now. Again, a pedestrian axial street with quite major amounts of housing surrounding it. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. Based, I think, on their ideas about what Coventry could be. So I think there's a sort of two-way process going on here. The Line Barn is borrowing from Coventry's drawings, and Coventry is borrowing from the Line Barn back again. Ditto with the other big influence at the time, Vällingby, satellite town outside Stockholm, with its pedestrianised centre and these point blocks all the way around the outside. Again, I think borrowed from Coventry, translated, and then borrowed back. So in Northern Europe, at least, there's a sort of two-way process happening amongst planners. The other interesting influence is Gordon Cullen. His book, Townscape, not published until 1961, but all the drawings were being published in the Architectural Review right the way through the 1950s. And here's his famous serial vision, where he looks at a sort of hypothetical Italian hill town, of course, it's got to be in Italy, as you move through it, and the different scenes you see as you go through this town. A sort of picturesque idea about what a place might be, placemaking, different views, different directions, choices, and so on. And I think that that was latched onto by architects in Ling's department, which is certainly something that Gibson would not have done. So that the lower precinct under Ling became something rather different. It's shops only, there was no need for offices, so these are stores up above the shops here and here. It's paved, but there's an informal Japanese garden. In the middle is the lovely Lady Godiva Cafe with its sunblinds, best coffee in Coventry according to various reviews. Notice the handrails, nothing to do with Gibson's sort of detailing at all, based on the designs for crankshafts. Cast aluminium, these handrails. And there's the axis going back up through Gibson's upper precinct to the cathedral spire at the top. And there's Smithford Street, looking towards Hillman House, 1 and 2 bedroom flats for working bachelors. Lord knows what was going on. And the entrance to this thing, which is the Locarno Ballroom, there, much loved by Ling, is here. This staircase is the staircase to that, bang in the middle of the street. So cars are not going to get by. And various kiosks and so on arrive. This is very definitely a pedestrian street now. Note that the walls of the Locarno are decorated with murals, mosaic murals by someone called Fred Millett, and the shops go right round at the bottom. Locarno, a very, very important part of Coventry culture. The Stones played there. I regret to say that Chuck Berry recorded My Ding-a-Ling there, which is really sad, isn't it? It's his only top 10 hit, I think, which is sort of terribly sad. But all the groups, who were anybody, performed upstairs in this building, except for the Beatles who were at the Hippodrome. And there's looking the other way, down into Market Way. Here's the British Home Stores at the top here, showing these sort of cross canopies, rather similar to the Line Barn. This is the gas showroom, and that is a pub, which again, Ling introduced. That certainly wasn't part of Gibson's planning at all. And there's the Market Hall, circular, latched on to these existing buildings, old factory buildings over here. This is the lift shaft. But this great invention of parking on top of the city. And you could drive across all the roofs of the shopping centre, find your parking, pop down, do your shopping, and drive away again. The Motor City. Fantastic. The only example in this country, I think, certainly on such a level. See, there are bridges going across to the other buildings across here. As far as I know, the only example here, and this one here, is the first ever example of an open-sided multi-storey car park in England. Now, that sounds a bit crazy, but it was, in the mid to late 50s, a huge innovation, a complete revolution. Other architecture is perhaps a bit more gentle. This is the Belgrade Theatre, which is the first post-war theatre in the provinces, sponsored by the Arts Council, that great invention of the 1945 Labour government. So this is the first out-of-town theatre. specifically designed for left-wing theatre. This is where Arnold Weska's premieres were, David Turner and others. So that, they had a sort of good dose of left-wing propaganda here. The mural up here is by James Brown, an architect-artist in Ling's department, showing the city of Belgrade. The city of Belgrade gave timber for the inside, hence the name for the theatre, although Coventry had a twinning arrangement with a lot of Eastern European cities, Volgograd, Dresden, and others, which was, again, an important part of Coventry culture. But here's the same arcade, going all the way through Corporation Street, and this very sweet little brick building, which round the corner faces Belgrade Square, with this stone facade. This is the foyer coming right the way through to the theatre in there. Bill Berrett, who worked on this building, told me there was huge debate about putting boxes into the theatre because they're elitist. This idea, that people are not equal inside the theatre was very, very important. Looking at where this comes from, I think we need just to mention these two buildings. They are so important. The Indian Students' Hostel in Fitzroy Square by Ralph Tubbs on the left, 1952. Really, really, really important building when you're discussing 1950s architecture. Ralph Tubbs, of course, was Erno Goldfinger's job architect at Willow Road. So there's a connection, you can see it, to Willow Road, to this building, and then from this building to any number of other buildings, including the Belgrade Theatre, and many others. This lovely frame here of Portland stone, which runs around the whole thing, and then the frames within frames within frames, and the lovely grid that runs through the whole thing, all raised up on stilts above the ground. Very, very pretty building. And the original Festival Hall, another great building. And you can see the Belgrade as a slight sort of miniaturization, if you like, of the front of the Festival Hall. And there's a more sophisticated drawing of what Ling was trying to do to the eastern part of the city, with the grid layout of the Herbert Museum moved to here, the library put in the old space, this really weird graphic going down to Spence's porch on the cathedral, which is the Campo in Siena, isn't it? Slightly different scale, but I mean, that's what it is. That's the Campo in Siena. The fall, I may say, on the land is about a metre, I would guess. And around it is this loose grid of buildings. The Students' Hall of Residence is here, the admin block, the Students' Union, the engineering laboratories through here, the art college, and the workshops through here. And it's very interesting to work out what they were looking at for this. First of all, it was at a very small scale. This is the view looking up towards the cathedral, with Holy Trinity here, the cathedral here, wandering up through these buildings. The axis now blocked because Ling didn't like the idea of strong axes. And there's the model with Spence's Cathedral and this wonderful grid of buildings with sort of gardening in between. There was an old graveyard through here. There's the swimming pool back at Pool Meadow where it was in 1939. There's the swimming pool. There's the Herbert Art Gallery, and a notion about the library in there. And this is the laboratory building for the Technical College. There's the arts building, the first sketch designs for the arts building, this vast curtain wall, which was never built like that. But again, it interests me that Ling's department were beginning to experiment with new materials in a way that didn't happen under Gibson. And this slightly confusing slide, sorry about this, this one is the Students' Union building at Coventry. Notice the detailing on the corner. That is Crown Hall, Mies van der Rohe, Illinois Institute of Technology in South Chicago. And of course, they're the same, or they're not really the same. But someone looked at a magazine and thought, this is a good idea. And as you know, Mies did this open grid of similar buildings all the way up through the IIT campus. And amongst it, he built this actually rather pretty landscape, some of it used to shade the big glass windows of the buildings. So this little detail of the two engaged RSJs is exactly the same in Coventry as it is in Crown Hall, a detail which I may say is lost on Coventry University. And there's called Richard Starley building, the laboratory building, same detail on the corner, look, and the engaged mullion going right the way through, sitting on a brick plinth which has been somewhat mucked around. But there's the idea translated. And there's the hall of residence for Lancaster College. 21 stories, I think that is. And I wondered about that. It's bang next to the cathedral. The cathedral is just here. And the Royal Fine Art Commission thought it was fine. Basil Spence thought it was fine. And clearly the city thought it was fine. And I thought to myself, well, why did they think that was fine? Because at exactly the same moment, Spence was designing Knightsbridge Barracks. And the client for Knightsbridge Barracks was the Ministry of Public Building and Works, and the director was Donald Gibson. And it's just, I just think, what were the letters like going between them? So here's the Spence version in London, and sorry, go the other way, and there's the Coventry version, and they're just about the same dates. And it is, so I think it's fascinating. Because it's a sort of, Spence is just rather bigger, and he had to get a horse to the top. Whereas in Coventry, it was just a hall of residence. And there's the wonderful swimming pool. Best swimming pool in Europe, it said in the review. And they were probably right. The whole roof is supported on 4 columns. It's an amazing, great roof. And then this banked seating, you can just glimpse it through there. The banked seating faces the 3 pools in the middle. Fantastic building. Wonderful, wonderful building. And there, at the end of its days, I'm afraid, is the architecture department, designed by Ling, with this lovely pedestrianised courtyard, not parking, with demonstration materials intended to be the landscaping materials for the new Coventry. And this building here, the Undercroft, is a little shop window, beautifully detailed glass. So all the models and the drawings for the new Coventry were displayed in here, and people walking by could see them as they appeared, renewed every week, as they were produced. Very open, nothing concealed at all. And down in the pavement below is a medieval vault where Ling established the architecture club with a bar, and he donated the furniture for it and all the rest of it, which is in the ground underneath there. And I say the hollow's gone now, it's just gone, which is very sad. Ling left mainly because of arguments over where Warwick University should go. He was adamant that it should be in the city centre. But eventually, of course, the site was chosen way outside Coventry, and Ling thought that was disgraceful, and he resigned, and went on to be Professor of Planning at Nottingham and various other official jobs, planner at Runcorn and so on. And his deputy, Terence Gregory, took over. Gregory, as I said, was a great organizer, a great committee man, but not a designing architect at all. He was a graduate of the Birmingham School of Architecture and did his planning at Wolverhampton and Staffordshire Technical College. But what happens under him is all the young architects stay on and start producing slightly madder buildings. And it's very odd to watch. First of all, the new art school. The parapet here conceals a sawtoothed north-light roof-light building system, accessed in effect up these steps, so accessed from the first floor. And I think the idea was that the first floor would become all of the access of the city, with the dirty traffic down below, exactly as Colin Buchanan drew in Traffic in Towns. If you look at the plans for Hook Newtown, for example, you'll see it there. And you know, where does this architecture come from? Well, go on, you know exactly where this architecture comes from. Ta-da-da! It comes from this, doesn't it? Of course it does. La Tourette, you know, published in the early 1950s, the idea of this sort of shape with its windows jutting out, and then all the other versions that arose all around the world. This is Boston City Hall, Cal McKinley Knowles, finished just before the Art College in Coventry. Another extraordinary building, but the idea, I'm going to go back, of sitting things on a plinth and then setting off the windows in grids up above surely comes from that direction. And here's Coventry Point, not a hotel, but offices designed by John Madin at the end of Market Street, or middle of Market Street, I should say. It pretty well shuts out all light from the space underneath here. And the lights on the canopy were on all day to make it work. And what looks like a link block to two towers ain't that at all. This is actually just more office block. There are cores within these, starting at the car park, buried somewhere behind that tree. But precast concrete, because it was quick and easily available from firms like Bison and so on. And there's the halls of residence just next to the cathedral, designed at the same time with this very expressive concrete panels and roof. And the green windows are the original colour on that. Very, very curious choice. And I think probably the best tower block of all is the one under Gregory, designed for the civic precinct. So these are the civic, sort of ordinary civic offices. Very, very pretty piece of design with a continuous balcony around the outside. Very narrow, about less than a metre wide around the outside. But actually very, very beautifully designed. Lovely, lovely detailing. And you access it on foot through this sort of mini park. And the servicing is all one level down below from the back. So you don't see any of the service entrances at all. And the only street in Coventry, designed for pedestrians, was Hertford Street. Eventually, the old road disappeared, and this was designed by various architects under Gregory's supervision. The canopies have been altered. The panels here and on the end of that office block are by Bill Mitchell, sort of architectural sculptor who pops up in all sorts of places, including elsewhere in Coventry. And the gymnastics required to get a road to come under here and get to that office block require this extraordinary sort of mountaineering of steps and ramps. And you really do sort of wonder what they were on somehow, because it clearly, you know, is sort of not working that well. Much, much better is New Union Street by Harrison Hellberg, a new street within the city centre, this facade here, which is a sort of, I suppose, neo-Georgian. You know, it's a regular, strict bay with these lovely rhythms going along it, the centrepiece there where you walk through that hole into a little courtyard in behind, and then these long windows on the top, based on the weavers' windows of Coventry, you know, the sort of home workshops of Coventry from the late Middle Ages. I think it's a very, very good building. And you come through into this little courtyard and are presented with this, which is the old medieval gatehouse to a manor house long gone, repaired by the city and turned into the registry office. So if you get married in Coventry, this is where you can do it. And this is quite a sweet little building, designed in Gregory's department. But interestingly, what they did to old buildings, Gregory suddenly woke up to the fact that Coventry had almost no old buildings left. That of the 400 or so that had escaped the Blitz, about 60 remained, and most of those were under threat. So he got Freddie Charles. Does Freddie Charles mean anything to you? I doubt it. He was a sort of SPAB type, restoring architect, but he'd worked for Gropius and Fry. So he was really a modernist monkey, because what he did, he restored to a date, very un-SPAB, and anything that was before the date that he decided the building should be dated as was removed. So all Victorian 18th century brickwork, woomph, disappears entirely, and where the medieval timberwork is missing, he makes up his own, because he's an expert. And it is just bizarre what he does to these buildings. And they were much lauded at the time. Coventry was the only city that actually moved medieval buildings to a new place. So Spond Street, famous Spond Street, which is a sort of road of old buildings, none of those buildings actually belong there at all. They're put there as a sort of Disney World in the 1970s under Gregory's direction. And it was called conservation, and really weirdly, it became Coventry's first conservation area. And a really strange story. And if you look at the AJ reports of Freddie Charles's conversions, they are just alarmingly bad, I think. I say that as one who's spent a lot of time in life repairing old buildings and not removing 19th or 18th century brickwork. And at the end of Gregory's time, he produces the Elephant next to the swimming pool, the sports centre. Here's the entrance coming through here to what appears to be an almost windowless building with this undercroft traffic hammering through underneath it in this black hole. Again, the access to all this part of the city raised up above the traffic. And this amazing abstract prismatic box, which was finished in the 70s, designed much earlier. You know, and is, I think, way, way, way ahead of its time. I mean, just a very extraordinary object. I want to say a little bit about Coventry's reputation. Coventry was the only local authority outside the LCC whose work was consistently published in the magazines, and published, as I say, with the architects' names and everything underneath them. So the 1958 Architectural Review is stuffed full of Coventry buildings, an amazing range they are too, and some of the drawings I've shown you come from that. So thereby, Coventry had an international reputation. People came to Coventry to see the best of British planning. And it was highbrow and lowbrow. This is the Ladybird book, Our Land in the Making. In 1966, Newtown's an example of the town of the future, it tells children here. Oh, good for them. And there it is, a lovely, lovely drawing of Coventry. You know, the upper precinct with its wonderful flowers. Those flowers. So, you know, it is interesting how the word spreads. Coventry was certainly hugely instrumental in the creation of the redevelopment of central areas. Ministry of Town and Country Planning in 1947. Percy Johnson Marshall, who'd been Gibson's assistant, worked on this long before he became professor at Edinburgh. And this diagram shows how the old town, with its muddled uses and mixed up uses and all the rest of it, could be translated and sorted out with an inner ring road, an outer ring road, sort of radial streets, and the functions gradually sorted out. And that's exactly a diagram of Coventry. You know, it isn't precisely, but it's, you know, it's damn well near it. And that's what the ministry was exhorting all towns to do. So based on Coventry, it becomes this document, which then becomes official government policy, which went on, I may say, right through the 1950s. Also had a huge influence on other new towns that were being built at the same time. Stevenage, Basildon, Harlow, of course. And the diaspora of architects that worked in Coventry is enormous and complicated. I've got a list here of county architects in Buckinghamshire, Fred Pooley, Surrey, Norfolk and Bedfordshire, chief architects in Milton Keynes, in Runcorn, Auckland, New Zealand, planners and architects in Stevenage, Redditch, Telford, Norwich, Newcastle, Wilfrid Burns, shock horror, Liverpool, Vancouver. Ray Spaxman was the chief planner in Vancouver. So Vancouverism, as it's called, came from Coventry. The LCC and the GLC, and the Ministry of Town and Country Planning, and the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. So all of those institutions had Coventry-trained architects through the 50s, the 60s, and into the 70s. Coventry hasn't fared well. I won't go into what happened in the 1970s and 80s, but it went sadly wrong. And it was ill-led, and the architecture was disregarded. So things like Broadgate House got filled in because it was a bit more rentable value, you know. Other types of shopping centre arrived mostly on the sort of American Mall version. So this is the upper precinct a few years ago. It's not like that now, but this thing is the access to a glitzy West Orchard shopping centre, which is across here. So it fills up the whole precinct with this thing here, and the shops are pretty well abandoned. The lower precinct got glazed over by a developer. Michael Orchid is the guilty party here. So badly done. I mean, just atrociously badly done. And that lovely garden has become this crappy paving with these sort of children's play objects thrown onto it. It takes no regard of the module of the old buildings, and the poor old Godiva cafe has been emasculated, or whatever the word is, you know, and is left there sort of stranded in this sort of living hell. And it's just very, very, very sad what's happened to it. And I may say the ring road, extraordinary though it is, has been and continues to be a real problem for Coventry. Colin Buchanan said it was too small, you know, too tight around the centre, and he was probably right. This is the elevated bit as you come round to the west. So the connection between the city centre, which is somewhere there, to the suburbs, which are somewhere here, is by dirty ramps and things that go down and underground and across, or you risk life and limb jumping over barriers to get there. And just here, you see IKEA's store, the only in-town IKEA in the country, opened around 2015, closed in 2020, having made no money whatsoever. And it's still there, and it's still derelict. And last slide, there's the northern part of the ring road. And you can see, you know, the gaps between roundabouts and then slip roads, and then more slip roads. I tell you, I have driven it, and once you're on, there's that sort of sigh of relief. But it's a bit like the New Jersey Expressway, you know, it's really New Jersey Turnpike, it's sort of living hell, you know. It is, I challenge anyone to drive this and stay sane, you know. It is just really, really tricky. And the connections underneath it, this one through here, this is Lady Herbert's garden, given by Sir Alfred Herbert in memory of his wife in the 1930s. Bits of the old city wall are in here. And the journey underneath here through to Swanswell is absolutely horrendous. And I just mentioned that outside the ring. That's the bus station, bus garage, by Harry Noble, who was Gregory's successor, the last city architect and planner of the city. When he retired, the post was never renewed, and Coventry no longer has an architect's department after the reorganisation of 1974. But you can just see the end of Spencer's Cathedral. There's the Hall of Residence, there's the swimming pool, there's the elephant, and there's the Technical College in there. So hours and hours and days of weeks were spent planning that. But this thing takes up more room, more space, and does more harm than any building ever could. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.